Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Life Shift podcast. I am here with Kristy. Hey, Kristy.
Hey, Matt.
How are you today?
I'm nervous.
You're nervous and you're a podcaster. You shouldn't be nervous.
It's just so different on the other side of the mic. I know you know that.
And to be honest, and I don't know if this happens to you, you have a podcast you co-host with a former guest of the Life Shift podcast called The Opposite of Small Talk, which I was also a guest on, which was lovely. But as a podcaster, I still get nervous before I record an episode with someone. Has that happened to you?
Yes, I do. Sometimes more than others. I would imagine for you, people's life stories are pretty... I'm sure you feel, because I know you, that you need to take a level of care with people's life stories. If someone's coming on and they're promoting their book on The Opposite of Small Talk, it's a little less personal. I feel a little more comfortable and less nervous. But yes, there's always a certain element of nerves.
I like it now. I think I embrace it. I was writing out what my pre-show rituals are because I have dogs and I have to put on like white noise in the hallway and kick the dogs out and turn the fan off and do all these extra things. And so I think that helps me kind of calm my nerves in a weird way. But anyway, this is not about how we feel as podcasters, but you are a podcaster, and maybe you could just share a little bit about what The Opposite of Small Talk is all about and what you do with your co-host Danielle on that show, just before we get into your story.
Yeah, that's great. So The Opposite of Small Talk is a podcast for curious people who know that there's no one right answer to live your best life. So we explore a really wide variety of topics, and the idea is just to expose listeners to things that they may not have thought of before, to incorporate those into their lives. So we have absolutely loved it, and we have a couple of themes that keep coming up for us. Connection, reflection, and social justice are sort of the three big categories that we tend to gravitate to from a topic perspective.
How long have you been doing that now?
Since 2019.
2019. The before times, which is...
The before times. We're about to hit our 100th episode.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
That's awesome. And, you know, I was lucky enough to be a part of The Opposite of Small Talk and talk about my journey with the Life Shift podcast and helping to share stories and the impact that stories have, one, on the person telling it, right? There's some kind of power that comes with telling our own stories, but also creating a space that other people can hear that they're not the only ones going through whatever circumstances they're going through. And so that was such a great experience to be on your show. And what's funny is you asked me on the show a question that still sticks with me. And you asked me, what do you do to get your guests to be vulnerable? And I was stumped. I was like, what do I do? And so thank you for that question, because I continually think about, what am I doing? Am I doing the right things? Am I asking the right questions? Am I putting forth the right energy to create that space? And so that was a really great moment when I think sometimes we don't reflect on the things that we do or why we do them. And so you asking that question forced that reflection in me. So thank you for that question.
That's going to dovetail nicely into our conversation later.
Well, see, I didn't even plant that. And that's just how podcasting goes. As everyone knows, as they listen to the Life Shift podcast, I like for people to kind of give us what their lives were like before a specific pivotal moment. And we were kind of going back and forth a little bit, and you were kind of thinking, let me dig a little deeper and let me figure out what that moment is in my life. So before you share what that moment is, maybe you can tell us kind of what your life was like leading up to this particular moment that pushed you in a different direction.
Yeah. So I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia, where I happen to live today still, with my two parents and two siblings. And I had a very well-adjusted and happy home and life. I was a pretty good student, played sports, and my life followed a very expected and predictable path. I went to college, I started a career in banking, I met my husband and got married. We bought a house together in my hometown, and we had two kids. And it was a happy life. Nothing felt wrong or missing. It was A normal, happy, well-adjusted life.
Well, what's interesting, I like how you said that, like, it's very normal, adjusted, happy life. And I bring this up to a lot of people that what you describe is kind of what I felt was society's checklist for people that grew up in the 80s and 90s, maybe earlier, I'm not sure, but people of my generation growing up in the 80s and 90s just felt like society or someone told us this is the order you need to do things. In order to have a good life, you have to do high school, then you need to go to a good college, then you need to get a good job, then you need to get married, then you need to have kids. You need to do all these things. Did you feel a societal pressure to do all that, or was it just like a natural occurrence and that's kind of how life was happening for you?
I am 100% confident that there were mental models that I was following that was planted in everything around me that was driving my decision making, for sure.
Do you feel that, was there any time during that period where you wanted to kind of veer off that track, or no?
No.
And do you think it was not a want, but what I'm trying to ask is, did up here or in your heart, did you want to do anything different, but you felt like you couldn't? Okay.
No, like I didn't feel pressure to live this life.
Okay.
I don't think I decided it though myself.
Okay. And so why banking? What drew you, you know what I'm saying? Like, I always wanted to be a banker. I don't know. Did you play Monopoly a lot as a child and you were just the banker?
No, I did not go to school to study to be a banker.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, I spent 20 years working in credit card services, only to realize that like I don't really love the numbers and I like people more. And now I work in HR. So I, take that for whatever it's worth. They were who was hiring when I graduated, and I knew people who worked at this big company that was nearby. That was how that decision happened. It was the opportunity that was in front of me. It wasn't something that I was specifically pursuing.
Right. Do you feel that you were allowed to dream? Or not allowed, maybe allowed is not the right word. Do you feel that you were, I don't know, I felt in high school, for me, I felt that I was never allowed to dream, or I had dreams, but it was like, those are dreams. You can't actually do those things. You have to go work for a bank. You have to go do whatever opportunity is there, you need to take it. Not, I want to go work for MTV. I should try to get there somehow.
Yeah.
Did you have any kind of like feeling where like you felt like you were allowed to dream about something, or was it more kind of like just what it was?
I don't think creativity wasn't necessarily promoted as a career path. So it was supported. I played the piano. I was always a very creative person, arts and crafts, all of those kinds of things. But that was never something that would be promoted as a viable way to spend your life. I think the other thing I would share, just, being a woman, I grew up in a household where my mom did not work and my dad worked a lot. And so in a way, I was carving my own path because I knew from the get-go that I was going to have a career, and a big career. And that was never a question in my mind, even though that wasn't the model I was shown. Like I knew that was going to be what I wanted in my life.
Yeah. So that maybe there was a little bit of a subconscious bucking the system, or like, I don't want to, as much as I love my mother and what she does, or maybe not, but as much as I appreciate this circumstance that my mother is afforded, I don't want that. So maybe there was a little bit of like, oh, well, I got to be more independent in some way, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair.
I think it's fair. I think it's interesting too, because, I've so many episodes I talk to people about this weird societal checklist that I know didn't exist anywhere. It just felt like I was following it.
What existed everywhere, Matt. Like literally every movie, every book, every interaction that you have with people is where it exists.
Yeah. But it's weird because I don't think my family ever my family never said it out loud that this is what is expected of you and you must go do this. It was just like I put that on myself. And a lot of that probably has to do with my childhood trauma in avoiding upsetting someone or going against the grain, if you will. And so, maybe that is a little bit of that, but, good for you for enjoying the ride that was that checklist, at least until the point that you've explained so far. So, did you just continue on that list? Like, what comes after? Okay, I got married, I bought a house. What comes after that for you in this checklist?
Your life shift moment happens.
Really? So like what was building up to that?
I mean, I was living the checklist life,
and you were enjoying it.
And I was happy.
Okay. But something was maybe bubbling under. What do you got?
All right.
Tell me a little bit about that moment.
All right. Here's what I got. So I was 37 years old and I read a book called Conquer Worry. And this was a book about how to manage anxiety and stress. And I'm not a particularly anxious person, but it just so happened that my brother wrote the book.
Okay.
And so I was being a good sister in reading this book. And the concept of the book is that it gives you a set of what they call protocols. I think maybe 36, 40 different protocols that you can do to help manage the stress in your life. And the idea is that you pick 3, 4 of them and you try them for a period of 30 days and observe how it impacts your feelings of stress and anxiety in your life. And I came across, I decided, okay, well, I'm a good sister. I'm not only going to read the book, I'm actually going to do these protocols for 30 days and report back to him and tell him what I think of his book and process and the impact that he's making on the world. And so I come across this protocol that says, establish a consistent bedtime. Now, Matt, let me describe for you what my bedtime routine was in that moment. I'm 37 years old. I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. And so my practice was after dinner, I counted the minutes until both my kids and my husband would be in bed. And then I would get on the couch and I would get cheese and crackers. And Matt, it wasn't even good cheese. It was like deli American single slices of cheese that I would break up and put on Triscuits.
Well, at least it wasn't Kraft.
Yes. Yeah. At least it wasn't Kraft. Yeah. Okay. A step above. And I would watch terrible TV for hours, like reruns of shows I'd seen a million times and B movies that weren't even that good the first time. And I would go to bed at like 2:00, 2:30.
Oh, wow.
And I didn't learn until years later that this is actually something that commonly happens to parents of young children. And it has an awesome name. It's called revenge bedtime procrastination.
Oh.
And it's this idea that when you don't have control over your waking hours, and if any listeners have young kids, you know that you don't have control over your waking hours when they're awake. You try to take some of that control back by staying up late and being able to spend time the way you want to. Like
a little rebellion, if you will, for yourself. Although it's not really serving you that well.
No, not at all. I physically felt terrible because I still had to get up and go to work the next day. And plus I ate a pound of cheese the night before. So it just wasn't like the best scenario. So I'm reading this book and I see establish a consistent bedtime. And I realized that if I went to bed early enough, I could actually flip it and wake up before the kids got up and have that alone time that I wanted without eating a pound of cheese and watching terrible TV. And one of the other protocols was journaling. And so I experienced what Gretchen Rubin from her book Better Than Before calls a lightning bolt. So habit change, right? There's all these different strategies for habit change. In that moment, I changed my habit overnight. And every weekday since that date, I wake up at 5:15 in the morning and I spend time journaling and drinking coffee and having my alone time that I craved.
Yeah.
But without the cheese hangover and, feeling too tired for the day. So that was my life shift moment. But what it inspired, that sort of the avalanche effect from that really came from the journaling, right?
Yeah.
Because now instead of hours of mindless TV, I was actually reflecting on who I am, what I want, and getting myself off of autopilot. I think it's so funny how you picked up on the checklist thing, right? And I was living a life on autopilot. I was doing the next thing that was in front of me because that's what I was supposed to do. And it didn't feel wrong. Like it was, I'm happy with a lot of the choices that I made.
Right.
But I realized, like, is there more?
Right. Is it serving me? Well, and I think that if we look at that procrastination, or what was it? Revenge,
bedtime procrastination.
So if we look at that revenge, bedtime procrastination, it's almost like your subconscious was like, I'm fighting this. Like, I don't want to do everything that I'm supposed to do in some way. I just want to like veg out, eat the things that I shouldn't be eating, watch the crap that I shouldn't be watching. Just like, I just want to sit in a pile on the couch. And I think we can all relate to this. Like every so often, we all need our alone time. We all need just that moment to just be and do whatever without any kind of judgment. And I think for me, I'll do the same thing. I'll take a Saturday. I don't do it every day, but I'll take a Saturday and just sit there and go like, I'm not going to look at my computer. I'm not going to look at any kind of work I need to do. I'm not going to work on the podcast. I'm going to watch the worst movie series I've ever seen in my life, all 5 of them, whatever that may be, because I just want to and I need to. And it's just, it is. And so, and I think that's me going against kind of like the grain. So I'm wondering, maybe that was what you were doing.
But what I would say, Matt, is I encourage that, right? The intentional act of rest or doing what you want to do. I don't think I was doing specifically what I wanted to do. Like the thing that I wanted was the alone time. Yeah. Was the time with me. Right. I didn't necessarily want the TV and the cheese. That was kind of the byproduct of the circumstance. And that's where I think understanding how habits are made and broken and being intentional about choosing your habits is such an amazing skill to learn, because so much of what we do is just driven by our routines and not necessarily chosen routines. So if you can investigate those and then create the environment that you want to do the habits that you want in your life, that's life-changing.
What do you think of trying to phrase this? Why that moment? Like, what was special about how, like, I feel like sometimes we could read things, we can look at things, but until it hits at that right moment, was there something happening around that time or space in which you read this and then you realize, hey, what am I doing? And then I can take ownership of this to flip it around. Was there anything that was like, why then?
Well, so there is a common phenomenon in which people wake up about midlife to the fact that they have one life, right? We tend to call it a midlife crisis. I like to call it a midlife awakening. But I do believe that many of us have a moment in our lives around this age where you recognize that, is this it? Like, what, is there more? And I was right in that range. And so I think that, and then the combination of this intellectual exercise to recognize I knew I wasn't feeling physically well. I knew I had a lack of sleep and poor eating habits that were making me physically not feel well in my body. And so reading that book and recognizing that the thing that I really wanted was just time alone, away from these people that I love so much. Right. And so I think that combination of recognizing those things that I needed and then doing the math to figure out, oh, I can have what I need if I just make this small change, it sold me in an instant on it.
I mean, really, we should just credit this to you being a good family member and sister for reading a book that your brother wrote, because that's big in itself. Because I think, as a creator myself, and you probably can realize this, like most of the people like in our closest circle, they don't care about some of the things we do, right? And it's not a bad thing. It just doesn't relate to them, or it's just like, it's there, it's part of what you do, or they just don't want to hear or read it just in case it's not good, right? But you read your brother's stuff. Like, did you do that out because you really cared, or did you do that out of like obligation? I don't want to put you on the spot
No,
here, but were you
I
generally, you said you didn't have stress or worry. Why
so
read
the
this?
Well, so this was a period before I had done a lot of networking with different entrepreneurs and authors and podcasters. And so for my brother to write a book felt like a really big deal.
Yeah.
And so and he happens to be a podcaster, and he has been podcasting since like the early 2000s. So
Yeah, I don't
he's
understand
like
that.
OG podcaster, but his topic is financial advisors are his target. And I have no interest. Again, back to the banking thing. Like,
Yeah.
maybe that's a career limiting move, but like, I don't know. I'm never going to listen to a podcast about financial advisors. So
Not today.
I didn't consume any of his podcasts. And so here I really believe in his mission. Like, for him he told his personal story in that book, and that is not typical of him. And so for him to be vulnerable in that way and share his story, I hadn't even heard his story in depth. So part of it was wanting to like learn from reading about him. But then I also just really believed in his mission of bringing mental health into a more public place and trying to help people and have an impact. So I think all of those things combined, it definitely wasn't out of obligation solely. And it's a good book. And it's a book that I think I've given it as gifts. I've actually given it as gifts to new mothers often because it's consumable in a way that they're just these little bites of ideas to try. Obviously, You can see simple, have a consistent bedtime. That's a pretty simple practice. It's, a bunch of ideas like that for people to try and reduce the stress in their life.
But to your point, it's on paper, it sounds simple, but if your habit is as you describe, it could be hard, right? It could be hard to implement that overnight in the way that you did. What was you said that it kind of happened overnight and you really just shifted everything. What was the first thing that you really noticed that changed about you as a person by doing this new go to bed at a normal time, at a reasonable time, wake up early and have your alone time with journaling before the kids woke up?
So the first and very immediate effect was I felt physically much better. So again, I was going to bed at 2:00 regularly, not every night, but a lot of nights, and then trying to wake up at 6:30 or 7 and get ready and go to work. And that's just not anywhere close to enough sleep. And then add on all the junk food. Like, I physically felt much, much better immediately. But then the longer term effect and the other piece of the story here is just the value of journaling, a daily journaling practice. You can't underestimate. Like, we don't learn from our experience. We learn from reflecting on our experience. And that's a quote by John Dewey, but it's true. Like, you're living this life, and if it's unexamined, then you can't learn and improve in any way from it. And so over time, here's sort of the outcome and what happened from all of that. So at that time, I was in my banking job. I had my 2 kids, all the things. I hadn't made my own choice on which jobs to take. At that point, it was one of those things where I performed well in my job and people would tap me and say, come work over here. And I would. I hadn't made my own decision. So that was the very first thing I did. And I was able to secure a banking job that I liked. And then I started to realize, so I had been teaching workshops on communication and public speaking for years, and I had been doing it for free for local nonprofits or inside the companies where I worked. And I realized, you know what? Like, why wouldn't I do this as a business so that I have something that I can retire to? One of the things I was reflecting on is my dad was a workaholic and was forced into retirement at age 62. That was the requirement at his company. And so, like, he was kind of like 62 with no hobbies, no interests, nothing going on. And I don't ever want to retire, but I don't want to work a, stressful full-time banking job until I'm 80. but I'll go do workshops on communication until I'm 80 for sure. So that
Great,
was a
'cause it
huge
fires you
change that
up.
I made, starting a business and starting a
Yeah.
podcast. That all came from journaling.
What does your journal practice look like? I think that some people, I mean, I'm sure it's different for a lot of people, but what is your specific journaling process, or what did it look like to begin with, and how has it evolved over this
Yeah.
time?
So I'm definitely always open to evolving it. And so I'm not married to any one way of doing things. So I'll put that out there. And so for anyone thinking about it, don't overthink it. Just grab a notebook and write whatever's on your mind. My practice today, I start with I am statements, like affirming the kind of person that I want to be in the world. So, as an example, I am working on being a more empathetic human. It is not something that comes naturally to me. And so, one of my I am statements that I write every morning is I am a good listener and I am empathetic. So I think that's sort of the first. So I've got maybe 3 or 4 I am statements that I do. And then I will do a gratitude, something that's happened in the last 24 hours, something very specific, just a one-liner. And then I write. And I oftentimes will start with kind of recounting either what happened the day before or what's happening today. I can get a little bit, I don't know, like transactional about it, which is not great. But when I have a nugget of a feeling, that's when I try to follow, oh, why am I feeling that way? And sometimes I'll, unpack that a little bit. And then, so that's kind of like the everyday thing. And then every once in a while, I'll do like a vision casting couple pages where I'll think about what do I want my life to look like in 5 or 10 years. I don't set goals out that far, 5 and 10 years. That's crazy to me. But I'll do vision casting where I'll like describe all these different things that I would want my life to look at in like really big detail every once in a while. So vision casting is one. And then the last one that I'll do every once in a while is gold mining. Or gold prospecting, which is where you think of a problem. This actually comes from the Conquer Worry book as well. It's not his practice. It comes from maybe Earl Nightingale. And the idea is that you think of a problem and then it's basically like a self brainstorm where you think of all the potential solutions for a problem that you're having in your life.
I like that you mentioned transactional, because someone like me, I like a process. I like step by step. That checklist was super helpful in my life, at least getting me out of my teens and into like the workforce and those kind of things. That checklist was very helpful, even though there wasn't one that I was actually checking off. And so the reason I asked that question, and I like that you said transactional, is because I think some people are fearful of journaling because they don't know how to do it right. They don't know if there's a right way to do it. How long should this section be? How many sections should there be? All those questions come up in my mind. Were you someone, when you did that for the first time, was it comfortable? Was it weird? Was it hard for you as someone that's more transactional to just start into journaling?
Yeah. So I think initially my journaling was more of a diary. I don't know if that's the right word, right? It was an accounting of events without necessarily a lot of emotion or depth. So when I think so I was a big journaler growing up, like in high school and middle school, I journaled, and those were very much a diary, an accounting of what happened on this day. My view is just start before you're ready and just do whatever comes naturally. And things will there's magic that happens when you take the words that are in your brain and you put them on the page. And so I think it's okay to start from a very transactional place to get yourself in the habit of doing it, and then just continue to think about taking it elsewhere. There's a book called The Artist's Way that promotes a process called morning pages, where you write 3 pages of notes. And the idea is just literally you're dumping everything out of your brain. And people will talk about writing their grocery list. Like, it does not matter what it is, just whatever it is that's in your brain. And the idea is to kind of like get all of that out, because so many of our thoughts are negative and they're the same thoughts every day. And just get it all out of you so that you can let in the creativity that you have in yourself. One other tip though for people, and we'll have to check and see if it's still there. There is a website called 850 Words where you can do that electronically, and it'll give you like a counter for like you've done it every day. So some people find that kind of thing helpful to have that accountability of like, oh, did I do my pages today? So that's a online version of the same thing. But I feel very strongly that the physical act of writing is where the magic happens. Typing's not the same thing.
It's not for you. It could be for, other people. However, whatever works. Do you do it religiously every day, or is it something that you try to do a majority of the time? And if it doesn't happen, it's not like you're in trouble with yourself.
I would say the times that I miss would be when I'm traveling for work or fun. I will often not bring the journal. And that's really the only days I miss.
Have you ever gone back and read some of your earlier stuff?
No.
Are you not supposed to? Is this a rule?
I really should. No, I don't think it's a rule. It's funny. So when I get to the end of a journal, I do leaf back through, and at the back of the journal, I put the dates of some of the more meaningful things that I wrote about. So I don't go back and read, like I don't read ones from years ago, but if I were to ever pick up one of my old journals, or if my kids ever pick up one of my old journals, they would be able to look at the back panel and see, okay, everything else is just whatever boring, mom's going to the gym today, mom's recording a podcast today, but oh, look, here was one about something important and what she was thinking about.
That's so interesting. Would you go back to read that, like that first journal?
I had the thought, actually, in preparation for this podcast, I was thinking I should go find the ones that I started doing in that life shift moment. I didn't get a chance to dig it up because I'm not quite sure where they are, but that would be really interesting to see what they were like in that moment.
Well, and talk about a reflection. It's like an inception moment. It's like a reflection upon a reflection that you were reflecting on.
That is like an inception.
It could be really interesting. I think sometimes we don't realize how far we come. And I think journaling will help, right? Because you're examining or reflecting on more immediate moments in most cases. I'm imagining more in like the last week but to then take it a step further and look back a year ago and reflect on where your mind and your headspace was then. We don't realize how far we've come until we take the time to look back. And so if we're only kind of sitting in this time period, it could be a really interesting experiment for you to see what's different about you just as a human, because seeing the human changes are a lot harder as well, right? We grew up in a time period where you could mark your successes by promotions, salaries, house, marriage, like those, you could see them, right? And you knew you've hit the milestone, you've hit the next mark. But this is interesting as a developing human. How far have you come? Like you mentioned, you want to be a more empathetic human being. Maybe looking back, you might find that you are far more empathetic than you were when you first started.
Yeah. Well, so what's interesting is that my I am statements have changed over time. And so looking back to see when I thought to add a new I am statement is a really interesting point in time as well. Like, when did I realize that that was something that I wanted to be?
Are all of your journaling experiences all focused or attempting to be all positive, or is there a space within the journal to dump out that negative feelings and reflect on those as well?
It is a lot of dumping out the negative feelings and reflecting, for sure.
Because I feel like that there's something about journaling that I think some people have maybe a chip on their shoulder about, that maybe it's not journaling, maybe it's more like affirmations and things along those lines that people feel very like woo-woo about, if you will. And I can see people that are more type A like me thinking, okay, well, my journal must only be all this positive affirmation. And like, what if someone sees it? They need to see, look at all the amazing things I'm doing.
So I found a journal of my mother's, and she was fine with us taking a read through it. And it was written in like super flowery, 100% positive language. It was reading like she was expecting someone to read it someday.
Yeah.
That is not how I'm writing. I don't necessarily worry about others reading it someday. I mean, they could see, I mean, my husband would see things that are negative for sure.
Yeah.
And it's okay. It's how I was feeling at that moment. And I think that's naming your feelings is part of the value of the activity, because sometimes you don't realize how you're feeling or thinking about something until you put it out on a page. So I don't know. I think you have to be, it's, if there's one place to be real with yourself, it's in your own personal journal.
Yeah. It's so interesting how journaling has changed kind of the trajectory of your life. And, obviously a good bedtime and no cheese and crackers before bed. I hope you have cheese and crackers every once in a while, but
for sure. And I sprinkle
okay,
in some better cheese too. Hey, just one other thing to plant a seed with folks is the idea of journaling about work. Oftentimes when we journal, we're thinking about personal reflections and what's happening in our personal life, but there's so much value to doing a retrospective about that difficult conversation you were going to have and how did that go and how could it go better next time, or that meeting or that big decision that was made or the political stuff that's going on at work. Working that through in a journal is very valuable. And as a matter of fact, I have some journal prompts on my website. If you go to KristyOllinger.com, there's a section for resources for journal prompts for work, because there's so much to learn from reflecting from every aspect of our lives.
And that's interesting that you brought that up, because I would imagine that if I were to journal for work, if I were to journal, most of it would be attached to work and not in a positive way. And so, well, not all negative, but in a sense that it's interesting that I would imagine that many people of our generation are very attached to career. Their career is their life. When you go to a networking event, it's who are you and what do you do? And that's who you are, right? And we're trying to get away from that. I feel like we're kind of becoming more human-like and less attached to like whatever position we have in a job. But I would imagine that if I were to journal, which I don't yet at this point in my life, I would talk about work. So it's interesting that you brought that up, because I guess there are people that would only just talk about whatever's happening behind closed doors and things like that.
I think so. I think as an entrepreneur, you may be in a more unique position than most in terms of how you think.
Well, I wouldn't talk. I would talk only nice things about the podcast, but my real job, my day-to-day job is in higher education. And there's a lot of things that bother me about the education system now and how certain things and the certain ways that we have to do things for the current generation. It's a little bit challenging. And so I would probably journal a lot about that, which would probably help me in the long run. Honestly, I think there's some value in that. But that was interesting that you brought that up.
Why do you think you haven't had a journaling practice or haven't thought to journal?
I think that what I would do in journaling is what I do when I just write from my gut. And so I do that pretty regularly. And I feel like I process, like if I'm having a bad day, I write that out and then I share it publicly for the entire world to see how messed up that day is or how great that day is or whatever that may be. And so I think part of the value that I would get from journaling comes a little bit out of those moments. And then these conversations on the podcast also allow me to reflect more. I actually got really teared up the other day when I was talking to someone because I was reflecting in the moment of how this experience has served the younger version of me that's still inside, trying to still maneuver the trauma and the value in that. But I haven't physically done it. I've thought about it a lot, but I haven't done it. I don't know why. Maybe I'm afraid.
So you say you're writing from your gut and you're publishing it on a blog.
Wherever.
Social
media.
That's journaling.
Yeah. But I don't
That's
do it.
journaling.
I don't have a practice, I should say.
You don't have a practice. So you're not journaling the mundane and all of the negative thoughts in a rambly way that nobody would want to read. You're writing and putting it out in the world.
I am, but I'm also not crafting it. I don't believe that I'm intentionally crafting it, I should say. It's, I used to think to kind of like what you said about your mother's journals and that they're flowery and what other people want to hear, or you have to craft it in a way that you don't offend, or, you know, whatever that may be. And I feel that I'm at a point in this journey, and I think part of it's because of the Life Shift podcast. Part of it's because I've just processed a lot of my life so far and reflected on that, even in, you know, having the conversation with you and Danielle and just reflecting on like, how do I create a space like that? I think that has allowed me to feel comfortable putting out something that back in the day, my dad would be like, you can't tell people that. Like, you can't, and not, it was just the product of the times. It wasn't like he was like that, but it was just like, those are the things you don't share. Those things stay in here or on a journal paper. And for me, because I've seen the value of sharing story and knowing what it feels like to feel very alone in that experience, by putting it out there publicly, maybe someone's going to see it. Maybe someone's going to go, I'm not the only one feeling that way. It's okay. You know, I'm normal kind of feeling. So, you know, I think I do quote unquote journal, but not in a traditional way. I don't have a journal.
Yeah.
I don't write at a particular time I don't wake up at 5:15, although my oldest dog likes to wake me up at 6 o'clock every day. So I kind of understand, but you know, I think there's something to be said about building a positive habit in which you've taken, you know, in this perfectly happy, fine version of your life before, needing your own space. You've taken what was not serving you in the most healthy of ways, flipped it, allowed yourself the same time, but then made it productive in a way that serves you. Am I seeing that
that's
correctly?
exactly right.
Where do you think you would be if you had not read that book? Do you think you would have ever adjusted to switching it around? I guess at some point,
Well,
maybe.
I don't know if I would have, I don't know what would have happened with that specific habit. I mean, the kids are older now. They're 13 and 10, and they're very self-sufficient and want to hang out with me a lot less. So I'm probably feeling less of a need to take, I have a lot of control in my schedule in my life now. So that sort of pressure went away. I think the bigger question of what I would have gotten to where I am in my life, where I'm making more conscious choices about what I'm doing, would I have started the podcast, would I have started my business? I like to think something would have gotten me there either way.
Like hit a wall, like the rest of us.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And
just like, oh, but I mean, you did mention that, you know, you were in this space. I mean, did the book trigger that? Like, is this all there is? Or were you having those feelings? Or
well, I wasn't necessarily having, so I have always been a self-help.
Okay.
I don't know, junkie.
Yeah, well, you're quoting a lot of people.
Yes, I've always been into podcasts. I've always been into reading self-help books. I've always been into development, personal development, and that kind of thing. So I think I would have gotten there. I would have gotten there eventually. I got to be honest. I feel like we don't emphasize enough how truly difficult parenting very young children is. Like, it is, you are not, like, you are literally surviving for the very early years of their life, and that is it. Like, there is no space for anything other than keeping these humans alive. And I don't think people talk about that enough. It's horrible. So I don't know that it could have happened any earlier than it did, because I was, you know, in that, I was in the thick of it. But yeah, I don't think people really know what they're getting into.
There's no manual. But I think that's a great point, though, is that I think we're getting closer to a time in which people will emphasize that more, or will talk about it more, and that we don't have to paint this picture that everything is perfect and sunny and roses, and I'm the best mom every single day, every single week, every year. You know, there is life that happens, and things happen, and we make mistakes and we learn from them, and it's exhausting and right? Like I feel like we're getting to a place in which it's okay to admit that out loud and know that there are millions of other mothers out there that feel it, or fathers that feel the same way.
Yeah. So whenever I have someone in my life who is having their first child, I now tend to have, I try not to scare people, right? Because they're in it, right? They're pregnant, things are happening. But I do like want to let them know what to expect so that they're not surprised when they get there and they're not like, what is going on? Because it's not forever. Right. So like it's this really intense period, and it's magical and wonderful and awful all at once. And then you're out of it.
But it could be longer. I mean, for some, it could be. I was talking to someone the other day, and she was talking about how when someone has a child, she always goes to the mother or the father. How are you? Your baby's cute and all, but like, how are you? Because it's really hard. You're not sleeping. You're not doing this. And that's okay. If you need me, reach out. This is normal. This is what most of us experience. It's not all beautiful all the time. And so I do feel like even just in conversations like this, conversations that you have on your podcast, conversations that are in lots of podcasts, people are putting what I call the messy, dirty, gross parts of their lives out there on purpose to show that we're human and that you're not alone in how you're feeling. I had a guest on very early in the podcast when I was still trying to figure things out. And I don't know if she quoted this, but she said, your mess is your message. And that really stuck with me, because for so long, I felt like I had to like hide certain things or how I felt, or if I was depressed, I had to hide that. But all of that makes me a much more interesting human if I can share that out loud. And I've learned so much from the really hard parts of my life that I wouldn't trade. And so I love the idea of the mess being your message. Does any of that resonate with you?
Well, it does. And it makes you relatable and likable. So I talk about this in public speaking a lot. People put a lot of emphasis on removing filler words from your speech. But if you listen to the public speakers that you really admire, you will often hear filler words, but you don't notice them because you're enthralled in the message. And also, it makes them human. Nobody wants to follow a robot. Amy Cuddy has one of the most popular TED Talks ever. And within the first 5 seconds, she uses 2 filler words. People relate to people who are not perfect.
Right. I feel targeted right now by that. We were talking before recording that I remove most of the filler words. So if you listen to this podcast,
I have
in
said
your
none.
ears,
I have said no filler words.
I heard one. I remove the ums and some of those in just the audio only experience. In the video and in live speaking, I think there's more happening. There's more of that human experience. There's more, not distractions, but you know what I mean, in that sense that you're not really paying attention to that. In my opinion, sometimes when it's right in your ear and that's all you might hear. Someone like me, that's all I hear. But you're right. Human. Like, we're not perfect in our lives. If someone tells me that everything has been beautiful and wonderful in their lives, I question that, right? Because I'm like, wow, either wow, great for you, like, or I'm sorry, because you haven't learned a lot of things that other people that have gone through really tough times have. And so it's really interesting. And I think that we're leaning more into that. And I think that, you know, your point about emphasizing the difficulties of just being a new mother or being a mother of young children to a certain time period, I think more people are talking about it. I think that we're connecting on a deeper level more than we have. I mean, we're not there yet
Or is
completely,
that
but I think we're
sample
getting there.
bias because you host a podcast where you host very real conversations?
I mean, I think there is some sample bias in there in that this is the opportunity that I get to have. But at the same time, more and more people reach out to me, and then we record. And I've even had people that come on and they want to tell me about XYZ event, and they'll come on and be like, hey, I actually want to share something I've never told anyone before. And you're like, now's the time. Let's do this, because the mess is your message. There is someone out there. You are not the only person most likely to ever go through something, and there's someone out there that might feel like they are. And if you can hear someone else, we've done our job. But, I think you're evolving as a human through journaling. Would you agree?
Oh, 100%.
Do you
And
think
podcasting.
And podcasting, yeah. Do you think that the journaling has made you a more empathetic person because you're showing compassion to yourself as well through that reflection?
I think I have a lot to learn about emotion.
Okay.
And about different perspectives. So I think the journaling can help me process how I'm thinking about things. But when I think about how I'm going to become a more empathetic person, I need to do a better job of feeling a full range of feelings in order to be able to recognize and empathize with others. So that's my current work task. And I don't think I can do that from journaling alone.
But I think it does play a part in that, because you're forcing, for lack of a better word, you're forcing reflection.
Yes.
On yourself.
Yes.
Right. And so if you experience a moment and you didn't handle it in the way that you wanted to, or you didn't evoke a certain emotion, maybe you might take that time in the next day's journal to reflect on that. And why?
Yeah.
Why didn't I feel that way? It's so interesting. And I am compelled to start a more regular practice. I don't think I could commit to a day-to-day journaling practice right now.
I mean, it sounds like you were talking about your pre-podcast ritual and your checklist of things that you do. You could find a ritual that includes a few minutes of journaling.
It definitely wouldn't be a 5:15 wake up to do my journaling.
Yeah. Well, and I will say that just happens to work for me. I think there's a lot of glamorization of the morning routine, and I do not subscribe to that. You know what time you work best with sleep and wake and when you're at your best. And so I don't think people should be trying to force a morning routine on themselves if they're not morning people.
Yeah. I mean, I think finding that quiet time where you can actually have the time to yourself to reflect and do what will serve you best if you're going into the practice of journaling. I think that's, when you find that space. And for some, it might be morning. Some people, it might be late nights because they don't have to wake up early in like you were describing. If this journaling, podcasting, entrepreneur version of Kristy could go back to the version of you eating those cheese and crackers on the couch and staying up till 2 every night and feeling like crap the next day, is there anything that you could tell her that might trigger that to start earlier? Do you think she would?
I mean, I think I would have to go back earlier than that particular moment, right? And I'd like to think that past Kristy would be receptive to future Kristy's insights. And I think it could be as simple as saying, choose your life.
Like, how early do you think you could go back?
I think probably high school or college, would be the spot where I was very much a rule follower. And I think once I got a little bit of freedom in college would probably be the time where I would be most receptive to the idea that I had choices in my life and I could take actions and make my own decisions about what I was doing.
Yeah. I'd like to think that I could go back to an earlier version of me and listen, but I also think I need to go through all of these pieces to be grateful for what I have now. And I think what's important about your story is that we do have choices, and we can make those choices for ourselves. In most cases, we can make those choices for ourselves. And if that is something that people listening are feeling like they're just kind of going along the normal day to day, it's very routine, and they don't feel like they have a sense of self in a certain space, then maybe kind of what you do is an option for them, is something that could allow them time for that reflection. Just like when you asked me that question and it's still stuck in my head, on that podcast, it's something that could help someone move to a place where they can make those decisions and feel comfortable making those decisions, feel confident in making those decisions.
Yeah. That's always the goal, Matt. Anytime I'm sharing something that I've experienced, it's just with the hope that someone it has a thought that sparks and resonates, and it somehow improves their life.
And as a podcaster, that I think we all kind of go in there, is that like, did the right person hear that episode? Did the right person that needed to hear it at that moment in time, just like you reading that book at that moment in time? I've had other guests reading that book, You Are a Badass, like just right at the right moment in their time, in whatever time they were going through. And that one sentence that stuck out to them, or the consistent bedtime, like that one thing was there at the right moment and you seized it. A lot of people would just read past it.
Yeah.
And so.
And that's why, when Danielle and I started this podcast, The Opposite of Small Talk, our very first episode was about originality, because we were grappling with this idea that we were going to bring a podcast into the world, and we're going to talk about these topics that everybody is talking about. And what we came to realize is that we could be talking about the exact same thing that Mel Robbins is talking about on her podcast, but for whatever reason, the way we say it might resonate differently with a different person. And that makes it worthwhile.
100%. And to the reason I came on your show, and just the storytelling aspect of just sharing, it does something for us too. And hopefully you'll reflect back on this in your journaling tomorrow morning, and it will open up your eyes about something that you didn't even think about as you said it, as those words come out of your mouth. And then again, when it gets released, that there's these other experiences that come along. So thank you for willing to be a part of the Life Shift podcast and dissecting your life to find that moment that really changed things.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt. It's a pleasure, and you certainly have a gift for making people feel comfortable.
Well, thank you very much. And if anyone's interested in connecting with you or seeing those journal prompts, we'll give them the information in the show notes, and they can check them out on your website and connect with you wherever you want them to. So we'll put all that information in the show notes, and take a listen to The Opposite of Small Talk. You can start with my episode, which I'll link to in the show notes as well, and then subscribe to their podcast, give them 5 stars, a nice little review. You can do the same for me if you'd like. And until next week, we'll be back with a brand new episode of the Life Shift podcast.